They said the woods in South Mountain could breathe. That if you stood still long enough, you'd feel the trees inhale. A slow, heavy draw of air that wasn't quite wind, wasn't quite life. On some nights, when the fog pressed low to the ground and the moon hid behind its veil, you could hear it. A rasping sound, like a dying animal. But it wasn't an animal, it was a voice. The first man who went missing was a trapper. His name has long been forgotten. The locals simply called him the one who went too far. They found what was left of him months later. Bones half buried near a stream, clothing torn and scattered, his skull caved in as though by human hands. No one claimed him. No one buried him. The forest kept him. And then came the children. They were found wandering the narrow roads below the mountain, barefoot and silent, their faces grey with cold. When asked their names, they only whispered one word: home. But home wasn't a house. It was a mountain. And on that mountain was a family. The locals never spoke their name aloud, not for generations. They said it brought misfortune, that even the air seemed to change when it was spoken. But buried deep in police archives, in files that smell of mildew and time, the name appears again and again: Goler. The Golers had lived there for more than a century, hidden in shacks of rotting timber, surviving on what little the soil could offer. They were born there, died there, and in between, they bred only among themselves. The line folded in upon itself like a wound that never healed. Those who had seen them up close described eyes that never met your gaze, skin pale as bone dust, and smiles that flickered wrong, too slow, too uncertain. Children who moved as though their limbs didn't quite belong to them. Women who spoke in fragments. Men who stared too long at the ground. The stories say that when a storm rolled across the mountain, you could hear screams carried on the wind, not of pain, but of something else, something ritual, something learned. No one went up there willingly after dark. No one wanted to see what the Golers did when night fell and the forest sealed them in. And yet, in the summer of 1984, someone did. A girl, 14 years old. She came stumbling down the dirt road, barefoot and bleeding, whispering words that made even the sheriff's hands tremble when he wrote them down. She said there were babies buried in the floorboards. She said her father was also her brother. And she said she wasn't the only one. The officers didn't believe her at first. But when they went up the mountain, they found the truth. And the truth was alive. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The air in South Mountain moves differently at night. It doesn't drift or stir, it crawls. A damp, heavy crawl that presses into the skin and clings like guilt. The locals who still live near the base of the ridge will tell you the same thing. The mountain remembers. It remembers the children who were never born in hospitals, the women who screamed into rags so no one would hear, the men who believed blood was theirs to shape. It remembers the Golers, a name now spoken only in courtrooms and whispered in bars. But before the world learned it, before the headlines and the trials, there was only that mountain and the families who refused to leave it. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because somewhere, at this same hour, the wind that once passed through those woods still carries the memory of what happened there. South Mountain sits along the western spine of Nova Scotia, a long, sloping ridge of shale and pine that cuts through farmland and decaying settlements. To outsiders, it's unremarkable. But to those who grew up nearby, it has always felt like a border between two worlds. The one governed by law and reason, and the one ruled by silence. By the late 19th century, Small communities had already begun to vanish. Farms failed, roads washed out, and with each passing decade, families moved away, all except one. The Golers remained. They'd arrived as poor settlers in the early 1800s, carving their homes from the forest, miles from the nearest town. For years they were simply seen as stubborn, self-reliant folk, but slowly, their isolation deepened into something else, something deliberate. They stopped attending church. They stopped trading in town. They built new shacks deeper into the trees, where no one could reach them without a guide. Old maps still mark the area as unincorporated land. No roads, no schools, no hospitals. Only a scattering of hand-dug wells and dirt tracks that vanish into undergrowth. Those who have tried to follow them describe hearing faint cries that seem to come from beneath the earth itself. The Golers lived by their own rules. Births and deaths went unrecorded. No marriage certificates, no baptismal names. Just a cycle. Birth, labor, silence, decay. And generation after generation, that silence grew thicker, heavier, until it felt almost physical. There were rumors, of course, that the children were too pale, that they didn't speak right, that some had 6 fingers or eyes that didn't focus properly. But in those days, poverty excused everything. They're just poor mountain people, the townsfolk said. Best to leave them alone. And so they did, for almost 100 years. But in leaving them alone, they left something else to grow, unseen, unchallenged, and unholy. A kind of rot that doesn't stay buried forever. By the time the 20th century bled into its middle decades, the Goler name had already become more rumor than record, a surname muttered like a warning. Teachers in nearby schools would lower their voices when a child arrived with that look, vacant eyes, sunken cheeks, words that didn't fit right in the mouth. The paperwork always read the same. Irregular attendance, learning difficulties, unsuitable home conditions. No one ever followed up. Deep in those woods, beyond the places where even hunters dared to tread, the Golers built their world from scraps. Corrugated tin, rotting planks, rusted nails. Homes that looked less constructed than grown out of the decay around them. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and smoke from green wood fires that never quite burned clean. You could taste the dampness on your tongue. The children were everywhere, barefoot, silent, watching from behind warped doorframes. They didn't run or laugh like normal children. They moved slow, deliberate, their gazes too old, as if they were studying you. When strangers came up the mountain, a census taker, a health officer, a lost driver, the Golers appeared from the trees like shadows. They spoke in broken sentences, fragments of English twisted by isolation, and always behind them were the children. No one knew who belonged to whom. Mothers were sisters, fathers were brothers, cousins were both. It was a circle with no beginning and no end. There were stories, always stories, that the children were born wrong, that some couldn't walk properly, others couldn't speak, that their faces seemed to echo each other in ways that were too precise, too symmetrical, as though drawn from the same small pool of human clay. When one of the younger men went into town for supplies, the shopkeeper noticed he paid for everything in coins, so one the faces had vanished. He said little, kept his eyes on the floor, and when he left, the smell of unwashed bodies and wood smoke lingered like a ghost. The town clerk once described seeing a Goler child sitting by the roadside, holding a bird with its neck twisted the wrong way. The child wasn't crying, he was humming. When the clerk asked what happened, the boy simply said, "It didn't scream right." After that, Even the mail stopped being delivered up the mountain. The Golers seemed content to vanish into their own decay, to fold the forest around themselves like a shroud. But in isolation, something inside them began to shift. A slow unraveling of understanding, of morality, of what it meant to be human. Generations passed, names blurred, and from the rotting floors of those shacks, new children were born, each one carrying a little less light in their eyes than the one before. By the late 1970s, the world below the mountain had changed. Cars grew faster, cities louder. But up on South Mountain, time was still trapped. A place where no one aged gracefully, only decayed slower. The Golers no longer feared outsiders. They barely acknowledged their existence. What frightened them more was daylight itself. The exposure of what had been allowed to fester for generations. When investigators would later comb through the ruins of their shacks, they described them not as homes, but as dens. Rooms without order or boundaries. Mattresses on dirt floors. Rotten food. Bottles filled with urine. Piles of rags where children slept beside adults. And in the corners, strange wooden carvings. Crude. Faceless figures shaped like people, tied with twine and animal hair. The Golers called them protectors. But no one was safe up there. Among the children, it was hard to tell who was a victim and who had already learned to harm. The girls spoke in half-words, their voices barely above whispers. The boys moved with a kind of blank obedience, waiting for orders from older men who'd long since lost their grip on reality. What had started as survival, generations of isolation, a way to keep the bloodline alive, had curdled into ritual, into belief. They told each other stories about outsiders who would steal their souls, about spirits in the woods who punished those who broke the old family ways. And so, they stayed together. They obeyed the rules, even when those rules meant horror. One of the girls, years later, said she thought it was normal, that every family shared each other, that when she was told to lay still, it wasn't cruelty, it was duty. She was 7. Another said she believed babies were gifts, to be buried under the house to keep evil away. She wasn't lying. They found the remains, but still no one knew. The Golers had been forgotten, erased by poverty, by geography, by the kind of neglect that doesn't make headlines. It took one girl, trembling and barefoot, to break that silence. Her name was Becky. In the summer of 1984, Becky walked more than 6 miles through the woods before she reached a paved road. Her feet were torn, her hands bleeding. She flagged down a passing truck, begged the driver not to take her back. At first, no one believed her story. How could they? She said her father was her brother, that her baby had been buried by her own mother, that there were more children still up there, in the filth, in the dark, being prepared. The police expected exaggeration, maybe abuse, maybe neglect. But what they found went beyond anything the human mind was meant to witness. It took 3 days, 30 officers, and a convoy of vehicles to make it up the mountain. When they reached the first shack, the smell hit them before the door opened. The air inside was thick, the stench of rot, of animals, of something deeper. Children stared at them from shadows, blinking against the light. They didn't cry. They didn't run. They just watched, as if the men in uniforms were the ones intruding. The officers said it was like stepping into another century. No running water, no electricity, no separation of anything, not of food, of sleeping, or of blood. And then, behind a wall of rotten boards, they found the cribs, small, wooden, filled not with babies but bones. The truth was no longer rumor. The Golers were real, and their story was only beginning. The police didn't have words for what they saw. Not the veterans, not the ones who'd seen murder, poverty, or war. Because what waited inside those shacks wasn't just crime. It was generations of collapse. They moved slowly, flashlights trembling as they stepped over heaps of trash and torn blankets. Rats scattered in the corners. The smell clung to their clothes for days afterward. A mix of mildew, sweat, and something sweet and rotting. In one corner, they found a woman, her face blank and unblinking. When asked her name, she just smiled faintly and said, "We're all one here." She wasn't lying. The Golers lived without the concept of family, as the world knows it. Everyone was everyone's. A daughter could be her father's wife. A mother could bear her own grandchild. Children were both siblings and offspring. Their family tree looping endlessly back on itself, like a snake devouring its own tail. Social workers who entered the homes described children with vacant stares, malnourished bodies, and speech so fragmented it was almost unrecognizable. Some were unable to identify basic objects: a spoon, a shoe, a book. Others flinched when shown sunlight through an open window. When the investigations began, there were 42 family members living across a handful of collapsing shacks. Most couldn't read or write. None had ever left the mountain for more than a day. The interviews were worse than the search. Children whispered about night visits, of men coming in while their mothers looked away, of sisters forced to share the same bed, of newborns that went under after crying too long. Each story layered upon the last, until it became a mosaic of horror, one that could no longer be ignored. But what chilled the investigators most wasn't the violence itself. It was the acceptance. There was no rebellion, no outrage, only silence. They had been taught this was the only way life existed, that love meant obedience, that pain was part of belonging, and in a way it was. The Golers had built their own religion of flesh and blood, where bloodlines were sacred, and purity meant never mixing with the outside world. In court, one of the younger women, barely 16, was asked if she understood what her father had done. She blinked slowly and said, "He said it was love." Over the next 2 years, more than 15 family members were charged with crimes ranging from incest to child abuse. The testimonies were unbearable, page after page of what had been done in those shacks, in those dark rooms where generations forgot what it meant to be human. Newspapers called it Canada's hidden nightmare. But for those who lived near South Mountain, it wasn't hidden. They had always known something was wrong. They just didn't want to see it. After the arrests, bulldozers tore down the Golers' homes. The forest reclaimed the land quickly. Within a few years, only the foundations remained, buried beneath moss and leaves. But the story didn't die there, because some of the children survived. They grew up, moved away, changed their names, and sometimes they spoke. In interviews, their voices trembled as they tried to describe what it felt like to learn that the rest of the world wasn't like theirs, that what they'd lived wasn't normal. It was evil, disguised as tradition. One woman said she still dreams of the mountain, of hearing her mother's voice calling her name through the trees. Another said she never has children of her own. She's afraid of what might be buried in her blood. The Golers became a case study, a cautionary tale, but behind the reports and headlines, something deeper lingers, a question that no one can quite answer. How long does evil survive when it's passed from generation to generation, sealed off from the light? And when the blood remembers, does it ever truly forget? They say that after the arrests, The mountain fell silent. No more smoke twisting through the trees. No more barefoot figures drifting through the fog. Only the sound of rain, washing over the ruins of what had been hidden for 100 years. But silence doesn't mean peace. It means waiting. In the years that followed, the newspapers faded, the trials ended, and the world moved on. The Golers became a name whispered in classrooms, a case file cited in lectures about neglect and inbreeding, something distant, almost unreal. Yet, those who live near South Mountain will tell you different. They say that some nights, when the mist curls low across the road, you can still see a dim lantern light deep between the trees, swaying gently like someone walking home. They say dogs refuse to go near that stretch of forest, that the soil never quite grows right there. A few of the surviving children, now adults, have tried to return, drawn by a pull they can't explain. One man said he woke up in the middle of the night, hearing a voice whisper his name, the way his mother used to, the way no one could possibly know. He drove to the edge of the woods, but couldn't step inside. He said the air tasted like metal. Another survivor said she still dreams of that shack, the smell of dirt and smoke, the sound of her father's boots, the creak of the boards when he opened the door. She wakes up gasping. Every time, she says. The dream ends the same way. She looks down at her hands, and they're covered in earth. Some researchers believe the Goler's story isn't unique, that there are still families, hidden deep in rural isolation, carrying on traditions that time forgot. Closed bloodlines, closed minds, the kind of isolation that turns into madness when left to breed too long. Maybe they're right, because evil like that doesn't vanish. It adapts, it hides, it learns how to live quietly. The forest around South Mountain has grown thicker now. The paths are overgrown, the old trails are gone. But if you stand there at dusk, when the sky turns the color of dying embers, you might still hear it. A faint humming from somewhere deep within the trees, a lullaby with no words, a sound older than memory. And if you listen closely, you might realize it's not the forest breathing after all. It's what's still buried beneath it.